Chains rattled against stone, drowned beneath the roar of drunken laughter and music. Charleston's finest masters raised their goblets, celebrating liberty on the 4th of July, while liberty itself lay shackled in the shadows. Among them moved Samuel, silent, obedient, pouring wine into their cups. Yet every drop carried death. By dawn, 12 men who toasted freedom would lie cold, their veins poisoned. And the slave who served them? He would vanish into darkness, leaving behind a story whispered in fear. Samuel's life did not begin with a cry of joy or a cradle's warmth. It began with the sound of iron, the sound of chains. The first lullaby he ever knew was the rattle of shackles against wood, the bellow of overseers, and the crack of a whip slicing through the heavy Carolina air. He was born enslaved, and in Charleston's world of wealth and cruelty, that meant he was born already condemned. The plantation where Samuel drew his first breath lay just outside Charleston, South Carolina. It was owned by Richard Caldwell, a wealthy rice and cotton planter who measured success not in compassion but in profit, in how many acres of land he worked and how many slaves he commanded. For men like Caldwell, people were not people, they were tools. Numbers. Investments that sweated, bled, and could be sold for a price. Samuel's mother, Mary, bore those chains before him. She was strong, with a spirit that no whip could fully break, but her back carried scars that told the story of her life. She labored in the fields beneath the burning sun, her hands cracked from rice paddies, her body worn by years of toil. Samuel never knew his father. He had been sold before Samuel was old enough to walk, taken away like so many men, leaving only an absence that echoed through Samuel's childhood. That absence became a wound, a quiet, invisible scar that deepened his hatred for the system that tore families apart as though they were livestock. From an early age, Samuel understood suffering. He saw it in his mother's eyes, in the sunken cheeks of children his own age, in the cries of women dragged away at night. He tasted it in every scrap of food rationed out, in the bitter hunger that clawed at his stomach. Yet from those same years came another seed, knowledge. The plantation elders, those who remembered Africa, carried within them ancient wisdom. Around fires in the dead of night they whispered stories, tales of freedom, songs of resistance, lessons in survival. Samuel listened closely. His grandmother, in particular, shared with him secrets others dismissed as superstition. She showed him which roots could soothe pain and which berries could still a man's breath. She spoke of leaves that healed fevers and powders that killed silently, without blade or fire. The earth gives life, she told him, and the earth takes life away. Samuel never forgot her words. In Charleston, contradictions hung in the air like humidity. White masters toasted freedom, independence, and liberty every 4th of July, while the enslaved bent their backs in the fields just outside town. Samuel was not blind to this hypocrisy. Even as a child, he saw it clearly, how the masters feasted while his people starved, how they spoke of liberty while women were whipped for dropping under the weight of cotton. By his teenage years, Samuel's life shifted. He was taken from the fields into the big house. His mother wept the night he was chosen, for she knew what it meant. Boys brought into the house lived under closer watch, used as servants to fetch, carry, and obey without hesitation. It was meant to be a position of privilege, compared to the fields, but privilege under slavery was still slavery. Samuel became invisible, a silent shadow moving between rooms, pouring drinks, carrying plates, and enduring insults hurled as though he were less than human. In the kitchen, Samuel found both drudgery and opportunity. He was often sent to grind spices, fetch herbs, or stir pots as enslaved women prepared meals. There, he learned more than the taste of food. He learned the power of ingredients. Salt could preserve. Sugar could sweeten. And hidden among them, if one knew where to look, were powders and plants that could kill. While the mistress thought him dull and obedient, Samuel's eyes were always watchful, his mind always turning. What he hated most were the holidays. At Christmas, the overseer distributed scraps of pork fat and cornmeal, pretending it was generosity. On New Year's, slaves gathered in fear, knowing it was the season when families might be broken apart, hired out, or sold. But nothing burned Samuel's soul like the 4th of July. He watched as Caldwell and his neighbors gathered, boasting of their liberty. They raised their glasses high, shouting words of freedom into the night, while Samuel's wrists still bore scars from chains. Their laughter rang like mockery, their feasts like insult. It was a holiday meant to honor independence, yet it existed only for the white masters. For slaves, it was a night of humiliation. Still, Samuel endured. Quiet, patient. He bent his back and bowed his head, but he never surrendered his mind. He remembered his grandmother's words, remembered the secrets of the earth. He carried them like a hidden weapon, waiting for the day they would serve him. Over time, he saw more cruelty than most men could bear. He watched a boy, no older than 10, whipped until he collapsed because he paused to catch his breath. He saw women dragged into barns at night, their screams muffled by the overseer's hands. He saw old men worked until their bodies gave out, left to die in the fields like discarded tools. Each sight etched itself into Samuel's memory, layer upon layer, until his heart was heavy with rage. One night, rage became personal. Samuel overheard a conversation between Master Caldwell and Harlan, the overseer. They spoke in low voices over brandy, laughing about Samuel's younger sister, Ruth. She had been brought from the fields into the house, but not to serve as a maid. They used her. They bragged about it, speaking of her body as though it belonged to them entirely. Samuel stood silently in the corner, pouring drinks, his face expressionless. But inside, a storm broke. From that moment, his hatred was no longer abstract. It was sharp, personal, unbearable. It was not just about chains or whips, but about his sister, his family, his blood. He vowed that night he would no longer endure humiliation. He would no longer be silent. Revenge began to take root in him, growing stronger with every passing day. Yet Samuel was no fool. He knew rebellion required patience. To strike openly meant death. To strike secretly meant possibility. And so, he returned to the knowledge passed down from his grandmother. He began to prepare, gathering herbs from riverbanks, roots from shadowed woods, seeds that carried poison hidden within them. He dried them, ground them, and tucked them away in scraps of cloth. No one noticed. No one suspected. The masters believed Samuel was quiet, obedient, harmless. They believed he was broken. They believed he was theirs. But Samuel was planning something they could not imagine. And deep inside, he knew the stage for his vengeance would be set not on any ordinary day, but on the very holiday the masters cherished most, the 4th of July. A night of liberty for them. A night of death for them. A night that would carry Samuel's name into whispers of legend. But how would he transform his hatred into action? How could a single man, bound in chains, strike against 12 powerful masters? The answer would not come from strength, but from patience, knowledge, and the very food and drink they demanded he serve. The seeds of rebellion had been planted. Now, they waited to bloom in blood. Life on Caldwell's plantation was not simply hard, it was relentless cruelty, an unending cycle of suffering. The sun rose, and with it came orders barked by overseers, the sting of lashes, and the endless work of bending backs in the fields. The sun set, but there was no rest. Night brought fear, fear of being summoned, punished, or sold. For Samuel, every day was survival, but survival did not erase rage. He saw it all. He saw children whipped for stumbling under loads too heavy for their small shoulders. He saw women stripped, their screams echoing across the fields as the overseer's whip cracked again and again. he saw old men collapse in exhaustion, only to be beaten back onto their feet. The cruelty was not an accident, it was deliberate. Masters and overseers believed fear was the only chain strong enough to bind the enslaved. And fear worked. On most, but not on Samuel. Samuel's silence made him invisible. To the masters, he was obedient, a shadow moving from one task to another. They mistook his quiet for brokenness. But Samuel's silence was not weakness, it was armor. Behind his lowered gaze, his mind worked tirelessly, memorizing every insult, every humiliation, every blow. He absorbed their cruelty, storing it like kindling, waiting for the moment to strike the match. The overseer, Harlan, was the embodiment of that cruelty. Tall, broad-shouldered, with a sneer permanently etched across his face, he was a man who thrived on violence. He delighted in punishment. Samuel once saw him tie a slave to a post and lash him until the man's back was raw and bleeding, then laugh as the man fainted. Weak, Harlan spat, as though the suffering he inflicted proved his own strength. Master Caldwell was no better. Wealth had fattened his pride, and he wore arrogance like a cloak. He boasted of his land, his slaves, his harvests, his parties. He mocked abolitionists as fools. To Caldwell, men like Samuel were not even men, they were tools, beasts, possessions. Samuel once overheard him tell a guest, "Slaves are like horses. You feed them, you work them, you breed them, and when they are no use, you sell them." Those words seared into Samuel's mind. Horses. Tools. Beasts. That was what he was to Caldwell. That was what his mother was, what his sister was, what every enslaved soul on that land was. But the moment that truly twisted Samuel's hatred into an unbreakable vow was the night he overheard Caldwell and Harlan laughing about Ruth, his sister. They spoke of her as though she were an object, a toy for their pleasure. The wine had loosened their tongues, and they bragged openly, their laughter cutting through Samuel's silence like knives. He stood in the corner of the dining room, pouring their drinks, his face expressionless, his body still. But inside, his blood boiled. Every word, every cruel laugh carved itself into his memory. That night, Samuel lay awake in the servants' quarters, his fists clenched, his jaw tight. He could not protect Ruth from them, not directly. The chains of the system were too strong, but he could make them pay. He could make every laugh, every whip crack, every insult die in their throats. The thought grew inside him like fire. The following days, Samuel watched the masters more closely than ever. He memorized their routines, the way they demanded their food, the wine they preferred, the cigars they smoked. He observed the smallest details. Which herbs the cook used for seasoning, how long the mistress's tea steeped, how the overseer liked his brandy. To others, it looked like obedience. To Samuel, it was reconnaissance. At the same time, whispers of rebellion drifted through Charleston. News of the Haitian Revolution still haunted the white masters. They knew that in Haiti, enslaved men and women had risen up, slaughtered their oppressors, and claimed freedom by fire and blood. That fear made them more brutal. Patrols were tightened, curfews enforced, whippings grew harsher. Every master feared that their slaves might follow Haiti's example. For the enslaved, those whispers were sparks in the darkness. Samuel heard them at night, in the low murmurs of elders, in the fiery eyes of young men who dreamed of freedom. But Samuel did not speak of his own plan. His revenge was not fire and open rebellion. It was quieter, deadlier. He would not need swords or guns. His weapon was hidden in leaves, roots, and powders. His weapon was patience. And then came the announcement. Master Caldwell declared that this year's 4th of July celebration would be grander than ever. 12 wealthy planters, all men of power and influence, would gather at his estate. There would be roasted meats, barrels of wine, music, dancing, and endless toasts to liberty. They would celebrate freedom while dozens of slaves served them, silent and shackled. To the masters, it was a holiday of triumph. To Samuel, it was an invitation. He knew the feast would bring them together, their guards lowered, their arrogance blinding them. They would drink deeply, eat heartily, never suspecting that the very hands serving them were plotting their destruction. It would be the perfect moment. From that day forward, Samuel began his preparations in earnest. Every time he was sent to fetch herbs, he gathered more than required. He hid deadly leaves among harmless ones. He ground powders slowly, carefully, until they were fine as dust. He tucked them away in scraps of cloth hidden beneath floorboards. To any observer, he was simply doing his duty. But Samuel knew what he was creating, a weapon far deadlier than the overseer's whip, far sharper than the master's blade. The days crawled by, each one filled with cruelty, each one deepening Samuel's resolve. He endured lashings, insults, hunger. He watched his sister move like a ghost, her eyes empty after nights spent under Caldwell's control. He carried trays of food to men who laughed at liberty while holding him in chains. And each day, he whispered silently to himself, "Wait, wait for the night. Wait for the feast." By late June, everything was ready. The powders had been prepared. The herbs dried. The knowledge of how to mix them burned in Samuel's mind. He could already see it, the goblets raised high, the toasts shouted to freedom, the first coughs as poison clawed through their throats. But patience was everything. If he acted too soon, suspicion would fall on him, and he would be hanged before his revenge was complete. If he waited too long, the chance might pass forever. He had one night, one chance. And so, Samuel prepared himself, not just with poison, but with silence. No one could suspect. No one could know. He carried his fury like a hidden blade, smiling faintly when ordered, bowing his head when commanded. He was the image of obedience. But beneath the surface, he was a storm waiting to break. The 4th of July drew closer. Fireworks were already being prepared in Charleston, music rehearsed, feasts planned. The city buzzed with anticipation. Liberty would be toasted again, loudly and arrogantly. But for Samuel, liberty would taste different. For him, the 4th of July would not be celebration. It would be vengeance. And when the night came, 12 masters would fall. The morning of July 4th arrived with a sky heavy and bright, the Carolina sun blazing over Charleston like a furnace. For most, it was a day of pride. Bells rang in the city. Flags fluttered. White men gathered in taverns and on porches, boasting of liberty and independence, their voices loud enough to carry across the streets. But out on the Caldwell plantation, liberty was only a word, mocked, twisted, meaningless. The slaves rose at dawn, as they always did, forced into the fields before the sun had fully crested the horizon. Yet there was a different air about this day. The 4th of July meant two things on the plantation: harder work to prepare for the celebration, and the humiliation of serving at the feast. For Samuel, it meant something more. It meant destiny. From the moment he awoke in the servants' quarters, he felt the weight of the day pressing against his chest. Every movement mattered. Every glance, every word, every step had to be measured. Today, he could not falter, could not give away the storm raging inside him. He had to be the Samuel they thought they knew. Silent, obedient, invisible. The morning passed in a blur of preparation. Slaves scrubbed the floors of the big house until they gleamed. Women toiled in the kitchen, their hands moving quickly as they chopped vegetables, kneaded dough, basted meat. Smoke from roasting hogs drifted into the air, mixing with the sweet, heavy scent of spices. Barrels of wine and brandy were rolled into place, waiting to be poured into polished goblets. Samuel moved quietly through it all, doing as he was told, fetching, carrying, assisting. No one paid him special attention. Why would they? He had always been silent. always invisible, always useful. But in his heart, he carried his secret. Hidden in a small pouch tucked within his clothing were the powders he had prepared, the fruits of months of patience, the legacy of his grandmother's teachings. They were fine as dust, nearly impossible to see once dissolved in liquid. A pinch could weaken. A spoonful could kill. Samuel had more than enough to ensure that by sunrise, 12 men of Charleston's elite would never wake again. As the sun climbed high, the masters began to arrive. Their carriages rolled up the dirt road in clouds of dust. One by one, they stepped down, dressed in their finest coats despite the sweltering heat. Caldwell greeted them with booming laughter and firm handshakes, proud to host the grandest celebration of liberty. Samuel watched them closely as he carried trays of wine into the great hall. These were not strangers. He knew them all, men who had ordered whippings, who had sold children, who had spoken of slavery as though it were natural law. Their faces were etched into his memory, each one a symbol of cruelty. And tonight, each would drink from his hand. By late afternoon, the celebration was in full swing. The dining room glowed with candlelight. Music drifted from fiddles and flutes. The smell of roasted hog and spice stew filled the air. Laughter rang so loudly it seemed to shake the walls. Samuel moved among them, pouring, serving, listening. He heard their conversations, boasts of harvests, gossip about politics, sneers about abolitionists in the North. He heard them mock the very idea that slaves might desire freedom, as though freedom itself were a privilege only the white man could claim. They raised their goblets, toasting loudly to liberty, their hypocrisy burning in Samuel's ears. It was then that the moment came. The overseer barked at him to refill the goblets. Samuel bowed his head, collected the tray of wine, and stepped into the kitchen. His hands were steady, though his heart pounded like a drum. He reached into his clothing, withdrew the pouch, and carefully sprinkled the powder into the decanter. The liquid swallowed it instantly, leaving no trace. Samuel swirled it gently, watching the wine catch the candlelight, dark and gleaming, carrying death within it. For a moment, he paused. He thought of his mother, scarred and weary. He thought of Ruth, broken by the master's cruelty. He thought of the boy whipped for stumbling, the old men beaten for faltering, the countless nameless lives consumed by this system of chains. His jaw tightened. His decision hardened. This was no crime of impulse. This was justice long denied. He lifted the decanter and carried it back into the hall. The masters cheered as he entered, their voices loud and careless. "More wine!" one bellowed. "To freedom!" cried another. Samuel moved from one goblet to the next, pouring steadily, silently, obediently. No one noticed the flicker in his eyes. No one saw the storm beneath his calm exterior. When the last goblet was filled, he stepped back, head bowed. He watched as the men raised their cups high. Caldwell stood at the center, his face red with wine, his voice booming. "To liberty!" Caldwell roared. "To liberty!" the others echoed. And they drank. Samuel's breath caught. This was the moment, the point of no return. With every swallow, the poison slipped into their veins. Invisible. Inevitable. The feast continued, laughter and music masking the first signs. One man coughed lightly, brushing it off. Another dabbed sweat from his brow, blaming the heat. Minutes passed. The effects crept in, subtle but unstoppable. Samuel stood in the corner, watching, waiting. His face betrayed nothing, but inside, his pulse thundered. This was the turning point. The night that mocked his existence would now become the night that carried his vengeance. Yet even as he watched the poison begin its work, questions flickered in his mind. Would anyone suspect him? Would he live to see morning? Would this act of rebellion inspire others, or would it vanish into silence? The answers lay ahead, in the hours to come. But for now, Samuel had done it. He had turned the master's celebration of liberty into their own undoing. The storm had broken, and soon Charleston would awaken to find 12 of its most powerful men lying dead. The 4th of July, 1834. Charleston was alive with celebration. Cannons thundered from the harbor, fireworks crackled in the night sky, and patriotic songs filled the humid air. Torches lit the streets, casting flickering shadows on brick mansions and cobblestone alleys. The wealthy gathered in their finest coats and gowns, their laughter rising above the music as they toasted liberty, the very liberty denied to the hundreds of enslaved men and women who labored unseen to keep the festivities alive. Inside Colonel Whitmore's grand hall, the celebration reached its height. Long tables groaned under the weight of roasted meats, pies, and bowls of steaming vegetables. Candles blazed in golden candelabras, dripping wax onto polished oak. The air reeked of tobacco smoke, rum, and sweat, mingled with the heavy sweetness of wine. Every goblet sparkled as Samuel moved silently between the tables, filling each cup with steady, practiced hands. The men were already flushed from drink, boasting of their fortunes, their harvests, and their control over human lives. They bragged of how many lashes they'd ordered, how many acres they had gained, and how many enslaved children were born to work their fields. Their voices rose above the music, cruel jokes slicing through the night. Samuel's face betrayed nothing. To the masters, he was invisible, a shadow carrying their pleasure. But inside, every cruel word fanned the flames of his resolve. Tonight was not like other nights. Tonight, his patience would end. From a pouch hidden beneath his waistcloth, Samuel carried the powder he had prepared weeks before, a deadly concoction of crushed roots and ground seeds, mixed carefully to dissolve without trace. It was a knowledge passed in whispers, refined in silence, and carried now with the weight of justice. One by one, as he refilled their goblets, he let the powder slip into the wine. His movements were smooth, deliberate, invisible. A servant's hand, always unseen, never questioned. The crimson liquid swirled, the powder vanished, and the laughter continued. Another toast. Colonel Whitmore bellowed, his face red, his hand gripping his silver goblet. To freedom. To liberty. The irony seared Samuel's chest. He thought of the lashes carved into his back, of children torn from mothers, of bodies buried without dignity. Freedom. Liberty. The words were poison themselves, empty for those in chains. But soon, they would taste a different poison. The goblets clinked, a chorus of silver on silver, echoing in the grand hall. The masters drank deeply, unaware that death slid down their throats with every swallow. At first, nothing. The music played, the women clapped to the rhythm, the men laughed louder still. Samuel continued his work, refilling cups, carrying trays of food. But inside, his pulse thundered. He knew the poison would work quickly, but the waiting gnawed at him. Then, it began. A planter at the far end of the table coughed, clutching his chest. Another staggered to his feet, his face contorting in confusion. Laughter turned to silence, silence to alarm. Colonel Whitmore frowned, then gasped, his goblet clattering to the floor as his body convulsed. The overseer beside him tried to rise, but collapsed across the table, wine spilling over roasted meat. One by one, the men fell, their boasting replaced by choking cries. Some clawed at their throats, others writhed on the floor. Goblets tipped, wine stained the tablecloths crimson, like blood spreading across snow. The women screamed, their shrieks piercing the air. Servants froze, horrified, unsure whether to flee or aid. But Samuel stood still, his hands calm at his sides, his eyes burning with silent fire. The great hall that moments before had rung with laughter was now a chamber of death. The music had stopped, the fiddlers dropping their instruments in terror. The scent of roasted meat was overwhelmed by the sharp tang of vomit, bile, and fear. Whitmore's eyes bulged as he collapsed onto the floor, twitching violently before going still. The overseer beside him gurgled, his body jerking, then lay limp across the table. Another master clawed at Samuel's leg, gasping for help. Samuel stepped back, his face expressionless, watching the man's eyes dim into nothingness. It was over within minutes. 12 men, masters, overseers, and planters, lay dead or dying on the floor of that hall. Their goblets still glistened beside them, the crimson wine untouched in the last light of the candles. Silence fell. The surviving women huddled together, trembling, too shocked to scream. The other slaves in the room stared in disbelief, their faces a mix of fear and awe. No one spoke. The only sound was the crackle of torches outside and the faint fireworks exploding in the distance. Samuel stood at the center of the carnage, his chest rising and falling slowly. For the first time in his life, he was no longer invisible. Every eye in that room was fixed on him, not as a servant, but as the man who had brought the masters to their knees. In that moment, he felt no fear, only clarity. The chains that bound him were not gone, but something greater had broken, the illusion that the masters were untouchable. The slaves who had watched him now saw more than just Samuel. They saw possibility. He turned, walking slowly from the hall. No one stopped him. No one dared. The women whispered prayers, the servants shrank back, the dead sprawled lifeless across the feast. As he stepped into the humid night, fireworks burst above the city. Red, white, and blue sparks rained over Charleston, celebrating freedom for some, while below, the bodies of those who had enslaved others cooled in the summer air. Samuel did not look back, for in that hall of death, his vengeance was complete. But what came next, what awaited him in the shadows of Charleston, would decide whether he escaped into legend or fell into the hands of vengeance himself. The silence that followed the massacre was heavy, suffocating. Inside Colonel Whitmore's grand hall, the smell of roasted meat and spilled wine mingled with the acrid stench of vomit and death. Candles burned low, casting shadows over the sprawled bodies of Charleston's elite. 12 men, masters, overseers, planters, lay motionless, their once boastful tongues silenced forever. But Samuel was already gone. He slipped into the night with the same quiet grace he had lived with for decades. No chains clinked, no footsteps betrayed him. To the city still ringing with fireworks and patriotic cheers, he was just another shadow moving through the humid July air. Yet the house he left behind would never be forgotten. By dawn, the news spread like wildfire. Charleston awoke not to celebration, but to terror. Word passed from mouth to mouth, from street to street. 12 of the city's most powerful men dead in a single night, poisoned during their feast of freedom. Panic gripped the white population. Who could have done such a thing? Who dared to strike at the heart of their society? The whispers turned quickly into accusations. Fingers pointed at the enslaved. Entire communities of black men and women were rounded up, interrogated, and beaten. Some were hanged without trial, their bodies left swinging from trees as warnings. The city wanted answers, but Samuel had vanished like smoke. Some claimed he escaped into the swamps, using the cover of night to flee northward. Others swore they saw him boarding a ship bound for the Caribbean. A few whispered that he had been caught quietly and buried alive beneath the very foundations of Charleston, his screams muffled by the soil. But none of these stories were ever confirmed. Samuel became a ghost, unseen, unclaimed, yet feared. For the enslaved, his act was more than rebellion. It was revelation. Around fires in hidden quarters, they spoke his name with awe. Samuel, the poisoner. Samuel, who struck down 12 masters in a single night. Samuel, who turned the 4th of July, a day of hypocrisy, into a night of reckoning. His legend spread beyond Charleston, carried by travelers, sailors, and whispered by fugitives moving north on secret routes. For the masters, his act was a nightmare made real. They tightened their grip, fearing every cup of wine, every plate of food. No longer could they drink or feast without suspicion. The hands that served them might carry death. The fear that had once belonged only to the enslaved now seeped into the hearts of those who claimed to own them. In the months that followed, Charleston's celebrations grew quieter. Independence Day no longer rang with unbroken laughter. There was always a pause, a glance at the goblet, a shadow of fear in the eyes of men who had once believed themselves untouchable. Samuel had changed something fundamental, not just in his own life, but in the balance of terror between slave and master. And yet, his story did not end in triumph alone. The vengeance he delivered came at a cost. Innocent lives among the enslaved were taken in retaliation. Families were torn apart as masters lashed out, desperate to reassert their power. Samuel's escape into the unknown left a trail of suffering behind, one he could never witness, but one that weighed heavily on those who remained. Still, his act could not be erased. Years later, when slavery's end finally came, old men and women told the story of Samuel as though he were a spirit, a reminder that the enslaved had never been passive, never truly broken. His name lived in the hush of prayers, in the secret songs sung in the fields, in the warnings whispered in kitchens. He was both fear and hope, fear for the oppressors, hope for the oppressed. Imagine the scene one last time. A grand hall drenched in candlelight, goblets raised in arrogant celebration, laughter booming with cruelty. Then silence. Then bodies collapsed, lifeless on the floor, while a single man walked away into the night. That image, more than any record or rumor, is what endures. Because Samuel's act was not only rebellion, it was testimony. A testimony that chains could not kill the human spirit, that even in silence, vengeance could brew, patient and unseen, until the moment it struck. And so, every 4th of July, as fireworks blaze across the American sky, there lingers a shadow in Charleston's history. While the nation celebrates freedom, somewhere in the echoes of time, Samuel's story whispers through the smoke and sparks. A reminder that freedom built on chains is no freedom at all. The masters raised their goblets to liberty. Samuel filled them with death. And in that single night, he proved that even the most invisible man could change the course of history.